Well, good morning and thank you. And I would like to join previous speakers in thanking our hosts very much indeed for giving us, and me in particular, the privilege of commenting on Morocco's role in development, particularly looking ahead to the year 2030. So I would also like to add, you'll see I'm joining my colleague and compatriot, George Joffe, of yesterday in speaking English. And I think my reflection on this is, to what extent does the language shape the thought? I'm extremely grateful to previous speakers, particularly the economists, for focusing on, as we've just heard, co-development and the structures for this. As a political analyst, I'm perhaps more concerned or more interested, since I'm not an economist, in the political conditions which will make some of this work. And perhaps to follow in George Joffe's footsteps by talking about pragmatism, I've interpreted my task this morning very much as one of answering a kind of exam question. The exam question is here, looking ahead to 2030, where will Morocco be? And to speculate with a few reflections and a few ideas and one or two suggestions as to what the implications for Morocco of that might be. And the first thing to say is, well, let's calculate how far away this is. This is 22, 23 years away. So the first thing I did was to look back 22, 23 years to see where we were. And the year was 1985-86, which, to my memory, I was but a child, of course, then, was a year in which the whole of the Maghreb was facing a rather major debt crisis following the heavy lending after the oil boom of the 1970s. Suddenly, most of the economies of North Africa were facing a major debt crisis. So let's say over the last 22, 23 years, things have improved considerably. In 1985-86, there was no sign of the Arab-Maghreb Union. Now, we've already heard some expressions of disappointment over what exactly that has amounted to, but we should also remind ourselves, as other speakers have, that the European Union did not create itself overnight. My own country was excluded, or you could argue, excluded itself from the beginnings of the European Union. And we're now, so many years later, 50 years indeed, we're celebrating this year, celebrating the fact there are 27 members of the European Union. But in that context, to move on to the second task, which is what relationship will there be between the European Union, Morocco, and the Maghreb in the next 30 years? I suggest we are, as others have said, moving into a period of transition, and Europe is examining the extent to which, at 27 members strong, it can really have an efficient and coherent foreign policy. Yes, it is true we have the Barcelona process, which celebrated its 10th anniversary last year, but we should not forget that the creation of Barcelona, the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, was in many ways a reflection of a support mechanism for a Middle East peace process, which was then in its infancy, starting with the Madrid process and then the Oslo process of the early 1990s. And in many ways, Barcelona has been captive, sadly, to the failure of that peace process. We're now trying, the international community and local actors are trying to restart the Middle East peace process, talks and negotiations between Israel and Palestine. But in fact, in many ways, Barcelona was held hostage in its aspirations to create a zone of free trade, which would have included Israel by the year 2010, by the faltering steps of peace in the Middle East. So that's where we are, and I think we'll see increasingly the role of frameworks will be useful, such as Barcelona, such as the association agreements, the European neighbourhood policy, which in many ways has come to replace this, as providing, if you like, the ground rules for integration, as a kind of guarantee between both sides that there are rules of the game, there are agreements, there are undertakings, there are plans of action which have been signed up to. But they in themselves, without incentives and without clear leadership, in my view, will be insufficient. and indeed relying on the European Union's funding as opposed to greater involvement by the private sector, both local and international, will itself not provide on its own a sufficient motor for development. So clearly, for this greater engagement to take place, we need to find a role for the private sector. We've heard it described, but what are the incentives for this? There has to be some kind of pole of attraction in Morocco in particular, in the Maghreb in general. I have few ideas to offer in terms of Maghrebi integration other than those that have already been stated. But I will posit, if you like, the challenge, it seems to me, facing Morocco can be summed up in the dilemma presented by the kind of investments currently taking place in Marrakesh. There is a schizophrenia, it seems to me, looking from Europe into Morocco. On the one hand, one is aware of a fairly significant urban-rural divide. We know, we've heard already about the demographic challenges, about the challenges of basic education. Yet at the same time, the newspapers of Europe are full of travel supplements about going to Marrakesh, about buying property in Marrakesh, and investing indeed in the infrastructure of Marrakesh. Now, this can be seen in many ways as a good thing. It's a motor for the local economy. But at what price, if you like, the local identities, the local culture of the inhabitants of Marrakesh, the Moroccans who are there? I think we certainly need to see a role for the state here and a sympathy from outside for the retention of local customs, local ways of doing things. But I think the promising side of what the example of the investment in Marrakesh is showing us is the benefits of focusing, as indeed others have already said, on a quality product. In other words, far from going for a kind of investment in tourism that will attract large numbers of people, what we describe in English as bucket shop travel at very low values, it has actually attracted a higher end of the market, higher levels of investment. And it seems to me this is an area of specialization which includes the long tradition of crafts and workmanship in Morocco that could be built on for quality. Take a lesson, if you like, from Italian designers. Go for the upper end of the market. Because, as has already been argued, with competition from Asia, the offer of cheap and mobile labor is always going to be outpriced. The competition, if you like, with Asian workers will outperform those here. So the key is to have an educated and skilled workforce here. And I concur with everything that's been said about increasing the mobility of workers so that they will perhaps move to Europe and acquire some of those skills to Europe, but there's also a facility for them to come back and work and apply those skills in Morocco itself. Now, these have clearly implications for education. Again, others have spoken about the need for education, but what kind of education is needed here looking ahead to 2030? It's clear that we're moving beyond a situation where we have to tackle just basic illiteracy. You have to think clearly, it seems to me now, about what kind of education you need to prepare the workforce for the future. And it's very much in the hands, it seems to me, of the Moroccan state, the Moroccan authorities to decide what that looks like, rather than being on the receiving end, if you like, of the kind of offers being presented through European funding lines. I suppose my main line of argument is prioritize where you want to be in 30 years' time now, or 22 years' time, in 2030 now, and actually offer that plan rather than be on the receiving end of what is offered from Europe. Now, I'm not a development economist. Fortunately, there are many of those here, but I'm told by those who are that two signs of a growing and dynamic economy is the return of expatriate workers, particularly skilled and qualified middle-class workers, to their country of origin, and also the investment, the private investment of those individuals, particularly where they have worked in financial centres and have skills from elsewhere in their own economy. And I think the model here, perhaps, to look at is Turkey. When you see the mobility of capital there, you see the mobility, the sign of confidence that Turks investing in their own economy gives to other international investors. This clearly is a key area which has to be encouraged for the future. I think there's also a responsibility looking ahead of the state to educate individuals for the assumption of individual responsibility. Where you've had many years of state-led development, individuals will only invest and have confidence in their own abilities if they also are aware of assuming responsibility for the results. And this means also having a plan ahead for, if you like, new forms of socialization. Now, a few years ago when I was visiting Rabat, I made the observation when I saw the group of chômeurs diplômés protesting outside the parliament. Why could there not be perhaps a program for encouraging those newly out of university perhaps to use their skills to go to rural areas or deprived areas of Morocco to actually engage in the kind of social educational programs that many young Europeans do? There's quite a fashion now for young school leavers to spend a year or so before they go to university or even after university engaging in some kind of charitable activity. It is even seen as a particularly good way of enlarging their skills when it comes to the employment market. Now, when I aired this view, I was told this is socially unacceptable, and this may well be the case. It would take a lot of organizing. But again, planning ahead, this may be something inconceivable now, but in 20 years' time, having some form of socialization for social solidarity, for decreasing the gap between the rural areas and those who are urbanized, and we've heard already that there will be a larger urban population, may be one way forward. Now, the reason I'm outlining the responsibility of the state to be proactive is it seems to me, in a slightly pessimistic way, that the European Union, over the next few years, is not only going to have its own internal difficulties catalyzing and mobilizing for its own foreign policy, it's also, when we look at the larger region, the wider Middle East, very preoccupied with what in English I call the tyranny of the three I's. It preoccupies much of my existence, and these three I's in English are Iran, Iraq, Israel and Palestine. What they're looking for in the Western Mediterranean, in North Africa, are some good news stories. They will be involved, it seems to me, if there is something very positive to be involved in. But I think we would be fooling ourselves over the next certainly 5 years if we think Europeans will fulfill their duty to engage in co-development with North Africa unless the incentives are clearly there in place. And success, as we see in the example of Marrakesh, breeds success. Where there are people enjoying the benefits of investment, others will come too. So I suppose that is my message, and look forward to discussing these things further with you. Thank you.